See, there's something within us that wants to leave a legacy. But here's the thing you need to know is if God asks you to do something, don't look at the size of the job, look at the size of your God who asked you to do it. See, he laid down his life for you, so that tells me that you are not worthless, you are worthy. And this is what he wants to rewrite into your story. That reality impacts everything.
Welcome, small groups, to week number 6 of Mistaken Identity. I'm so excited that once again you are joining us. Before we dive into this week's lesson and a little recap, just want to give you a heads up of what's coming in the month of March. We will be hopping into a study called Master Your Money. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Kind of subtitle for it is going to be, or will your money master you? And as we get ready for that, just kind of one of the things I want to encourage you, some small groups, as soon as they hear, oh, we're going to talk about money, they'll almost go, all right, we're going to take off from the discussion questions during that short series because it's hard to have conversation about money. And so here's what I just want to encourage you is that we're going to actually set our small group conversations up week after week for very doable, approachable, and realistic conversations in regards to how we interact with money and what does God say about it and what does it mean for us. And there's kind of 3 different ways that we're going to be looking at and approaching this conversation about money over or in March. We're going to be talking about how it's really connected to our hearts, how money's connected with our hearts. We're going to talk about how it's connected with our faith or our trust. There's really few places in your life that you'll get more momentum in growing your faith than actually how you interact with your finances and trusting God. And then finally, how it's actually a part of your habits as well. And what does God say about that? And so it's going to be a fun series. Master Your Money. Just start getting super excited to talk about money with your friends, right? It's going to be it really will be a good time. But let's dive now into week 6 of Mistaken Identity. We're talking about leadership this week. And the main point, I was kind of contrasting these 2 ideas of servant leadership versus lording leadership. And once again, the main point was this. We all can and have influence. But how we influence will reveal our identity as either a servant leader or a lording leader. And I connected this idea, we're talking about leadership, but I connected it with influence because sometimes people feel like I don't lead people, or am I really a leader? And I would argue that you are a leader a lot of times just through the simple reality of how you influence others. Siblings influence other siblings, and parents influence your children. Sometimes people are going, how do I lead up in my organization or my workplace? And a lot of times that's just through influence. And I use kind of this just kind of silly little story about how even growing up, I was influenced by a neighbor kid when I was in elementary school, as he kind of shamed me into trying my first beer. And I was a young kid, and he was like, if you want to be cool, or don't be afraid to. And he used fear and he used shame to get me to try my first beer at, I think I was like 6 years old. I know it's crazy, but I was. But then I also look at like my kids who sometimes, some of my older children, they'll sit down with my younger kids and they'll go to clean up a mess that was made. Not by them, but by their younger sibling. And they'll sit down and they'll say, hey, come and join me and I'll help you clean up. And together they clean up. And what's really interesting is you see 2 sides of influence right there, 2 forms of leadership. Children are following other children. And it can be through an unhealthy way or a healthy way, through servant leadership or lording leadership. And so we're going to look at how in the world do we discern how we're leading right now, and what does it look like for us to lead as Christ would have us lead? You know, Jesus said this in Mark chapter 9, verse 35. He said to his disciples, anyone who wants to be first must be the very last and the servant of all. And of course, Jesus modeled servant leadership. So I've just got 5 observations. We're going to review these really quickly about servant leadership versus lording leadership. And so we've hit these or covered these kind of as leadership axioms. Axioms, just another way of kind of saying a rule of leadership. And so here's the first one. Leadership axiom is this. Servant leaders are not afraid to get their hands dirty versus lording leaders see themselves as above the fray. And I looked at John chapter 13 where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. And just this beautiful picture of Jesus literally getting his hands dirty as he goes disciple to disciple and really models taking on the role of the lowest servant who would normally go and wash people's feet before a meal or entering into a house. And this really cuts straight to the heart of servant leadership. When we say servant leadership, the model that Christ gives us is a leader who's humble, who's not afraid to get their hands dirty, who's not too important or too great to serve the very people that are actually there to serve him or who are following him. So his disciples are following him, and yet he says, I'm going to serve you. You know, I don't know if you've ever been in one of those job situations where there's kind of like when you get a job for the first time and all of a sudden all these job responsibilities come to you. They're like inherited because they're always the lowest man on the totem pole type responsibilities. Maybe you can relate, like you got a job and all of a sudden you're doing the worst thing that no one wants to do. I know in my kind of work history, some of the leaders that I've respected the most were those who would come and on day one, they would come right alongside me and do some of kind of those lowly jobs. And they would even say, now this is going to be your responsibility, but let me do this with you. And immediately as they serve alongside with you, getting their hands dirty, you have this greater level of respect for them because they're not lording it over you, like go and clean the toilets, but hey, let me come and clean the toilets with you. And they're serving alongside you. And all of us can appreciate when we know a leader is one that we can trust when they don't ask you to do something that they themselves are not willing to do. Jesus modeled beautiful servant leadership there, getting his hands dirty, really. Second leadership axiom is this: servant leaders develop others, while lording leaders actually dictate over others. And all this simply means is servant leaders recognize that it's their job actually to develop others for success, while lording leaders see people as pawns that they actually use, tell them what to do for their own personal success. And in that passage, when Jesus is washing his disciples' feet, in John chapter 13, verse 15, he says this: I've set an example for you, meaning I've modeled something for you to help you actually do what I've just done. He's trying to actually help develop his disciples to do the things that he does and to serve as he serves. And this idea of modeling is really everywhere throughout Jesus' time with his disciples, as he's constantly modeling for them to develop them. A lot of times we talk here at Lakeland, and maybe in leadership, you've heard this out there, the process of leadership development being this: I do, you watch, we talk, I do, you help, we talk, you do, I'll help you, we talk, and then you do, I'll watch you, we talk, and then finally you do. And really, Jesus did that with his disciples. He performed miracles, and then he talked to his disciples about that. He performed miracles and let them help. Like when he multiplied the bread for the 5,000, he said, now you guys go and distribute this to everyone. And they gathered up the leftovers, and they helped, and then they talked about it. And then there were times that he actually helped them, and other times that finally he just sent them out to do. And they were constantly talking about that until eventually he released them, because he had developed them to go and do all that he had done. Third leadership axiom is this: servant leaders allow leadership opportunities to arise, while lording leaders fight to lead. So Jesus, once again, he has washed his disciples' feet. This beautiful picture of servant leadership is at the Last Supper. Okay, so he takes the bread and he breaks it and he says, this is my body broken for you. He takes the cup. He says, this is my blood poured out for you. He's about to head to the cross. And then right there in that moment, the disciples, I think if I was Jesus, I'd lose my mind. They break out into a conversation about who's the greatest. He just washed their feet. And then in verse 24, Luke 22, verse 24, it says, they began to argue among themselves. I mean, it's like they're just finishing sipping the cup to remember this new thing of the new covenant. And they're arguing who will be the greatest among them. And Jesus has this short little dialogue with them about how leaders in the world, they often want to lord their authority and they want to strive for leadership. But he says, not so among you. And it won't be true among you. He says, you guys are going to serve. And then he actually does give them a little glimpse into their future, though, which is really, I think it's a beautiful picture in verse 30, where he actually tells these guys, someday you're going to sit on thrones beside me. It's almost like he's saying, guys, if you are a servant leader, you will eventually rise into the place of leadership and influence that a lot of times you want to rush into now. But it will come when the Lord brings it to you. Lording leaders are just going after leadership. They want to rule, they want influence, and they go after it quickly. Where servant leadership, you allow the Lord actually to raise you into a place of leadership, all in due time. He knows when your character is ready for that level of leadership. And so if you're chasing after influence or chasing after leadership, you're probably following a worldly model versus a kingdom servant leadership model. Fourth leadership axiom is this: servant leaders motivate by love, grace, and encouragement versus lording leaders motivate by fear, guilt, and shame. So, Jesus goes to the cross, and then he dies, and then he's raised from the dead, and he has a couple of encounters with his disciples. But one of the encounters that is so critical that he has is with one of his disciples named Peter, who, if you recall, Peter denies Jesus. He denies that he even knows him 3 times, kind of during this his suffering and during the crucifixion. And there's this beautiful encounter with Jesus and Peter that we often refer to as the reinstatement of Peter. And what I think is so sweet is that Jesus could have looked at Peter and said, "Shame on you for turning your back on me and denying that you even know me." He could have guilted him. I can't believe you acted like you didn't know me, but he doesn't. Instead, he has this kind of beautiful exchange with Peter where he says, "Do you love me?" And Peter says, "Yeah." He says, "Okay, then go feed my sheep." "Peter, really, do you love me?" "Yeah." "Okay, then tend my sheep." And then he asks him a third time, "Peter, do you love me?" "You know I love you." "All right, then feed my sheep." It's almost what Jesus is doing is he's leading Peter back into his calling, because Jesus had spoken over Peter, "You're going to be the rock upon my church, or the rock upon which my church will be built." And what he's doing is he's saying, "Peter, that's your calling." And in grace and in a sweet way, what he's doing is he's saying, "Remember how you denied me, acted like you didn't even know me, and you acted like you weren't even with me." When he's asking him, "Do you love me?" what he's really saying is, "Are you with me? All right, if you're with me, then let me remind you of your calling. It's time that you go and you lead my church and you care for the sheep of the church." He just models, instead of guilt or shame or fear, he models such grace and love and really encouragement for Peter to step back into his call. I don't know about you, almost all of us learn to influence people through, a lot of times it might be a parent or friends or even a boss. I don't know what you've learned, but you've probably learned to lead or to influence through either unhealthy lording leadership with fear and guilt and shame, or maybe some healthy modeling through grace and love and encouragement. But I would really challenge you to ask yourself, how do you lead people or influence people? Do you do it through lording leadership or servant leadership? Final leadership axiom is this, fifth one. Servant leaders focus on the success of the next generation, while lording leaders really just focus on their current success. And I looked actually not at Jesus. Jesus was so concerned about the next generation. It was all about raising up the disciples so that they could lead the future church without him there. But I actually went to Moses and Hezekiah, 2 different guys, but just their approach as they knew their life was coming to an end. When Moses finds out that he's not going to lead the children of Israel into the promised land, he says to the Lord in Numbers 27:15, Moses said to the Lord, "May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community." He was so concerned that there would be a leader to lead the people into the promised land. And then the Lord basically raises up Joshua and says, Joshua is going to be the guy that you need to anoint and commission to lead the people. Hezekiah is another, actually, he's a great king, but at the end of his life, he really blows it. The Lord, he gets sick, and the Lord is so gracious to actually extend his life in a miraculous way. But then in pride, he shows his wealth to the Babylonian kings. And the Lord actually says, because you were so prideful in how you showed it and displayed it, the word of the Lord came to him and said, you're going to actually lose everything that your ancestors have stored up for you. It will all be lost to the Babylonians. Some of your sons are even going to go and they're going to have to serve in the house of the kings of Babylon. They're going to become eunuchs. And Hezekiah says one of the most alarming, it's one of the most alarming verses in Scripture. He says this, the word of the Lord that you have spoken is good, which is crazy because it's bad news. But then it goes on to explain why he said that. For Hezekiah was thinking, at least there will be peace and security in my lifetime. See, his entire mindset is just about what he'll experience. He's got this leadership mindset that's just focused around his success and what he'll experience, not about future generations. And servant leaders are thinking about the next generation and how do we set them up to actually go further than we ever went with greater success. And so in your small groups this week, I just want you to talk about what's maybe the type of leadership that was modeled to you over the years in your life. How have you been taught to influence? Has it been through fear, shame, guilt, or love, grace, encouragement? What servant leadership principle can you apply this week in your life? And so enjoy your conversations, and we'll see you guys next week.